Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I'm going to be covering common takeoff and departure mistakes that you might be making in Microsoft Flight Sim. I've covered landings in a lot of detail already, and I thought it might be interesting to turn the tables and to look at takeoffs a little bit more in depth instead. Takeoffs are challenging in their own right because there's a lot going on in a very short period of time. In the space of a couple seconds, you go from taxiing to the runway to your climb up to your cruise altitude. There's a lot of things to coordinate in that very short little burst of time, even in general aviation airplanes, and I'm going to cover the things that I tend to forget about or that I should be paying more attention to as I'm getting ready to start my flight. You'll get the most value from this video if you've got some experience flying around in Flight Sim and you're looking to improve your skills, but even someone who has a lot of experience in Flight Sim might learn a thing or two in this video as well. Alright, let's get right to it. The first takeoff mistake happens even before you get to the runway, and that's choosing the wrong runway for takeoff. There are 3 criteria that I use to make my decision on which runway I'm going to be taking off from. That's the wind direction, the length of the runway, and lastly, any obstacles that I need to avoid near the end of the runway. Let's start by looking at wind. An airplane depends on airspeed to get airborne, and a good headwind is actually going to help push you in the right direction before you even start rolling down the runway. You might have already seen videos of this on YouTube where someone makes the airplane fly without actually moving. They just crank the wind up really high, and the airplane can quite literally get airborne while standing still. It's the same concept here, but just a little bit more grounded in reality. A headwind also decreases the ground speed that you need to get airborne. A lower ground speed means you're going to need a smaller ground roll distance, which in turn is going to allow you to use a shorter runway as well. That said, you're still going to want to use a runway that's going to be longer than the shortest takeoff distance rated for the airplane. It's entirely possible to land at certain airfields and not be able to take off from them afterwards because takeoff distances are always longer than landing distances. Minimum takeoff distances aren't listed in Flight Sim as far as I know, and while I could look them up individually, I use a rule of thumb called the 50 to 70 rule that works nicely with any general aviation airplane. All I've got to do is pick a landmark that's at about the halfway point of the runway, and if I get there before achieving 70% of my takeoff speed, I'm gonna abort the takeoff. For example, takeoff speed in the Cessna 208 is 74 knots, and 70% of that is about 52 knots. The halfway point of this runway is probably this taxiway right here. It's probably not exactly, but it'll be close enough for what I'm gonna need it for. So as I'm accelerating down the runway, if I get to the halfway point, which is this taxiway here, and I haven't reached 52 knots yet, I'm going to kill the throttle and I'm gonna abort that takeoff. The way the math works out for the 50-70 rule, there should always be enough place for you to come to a complete stop before running out of runway. Once you've aborted the takeoff, you can either change runways for a longer runway if that's an option, or you can lighten your load and try to take off again. The one thing the 50-70 rule doesn't guarantee though is if I'll have enough clearance to get over any obstacles at the end of the runway. If I'm not familiar with the runway I'm taking off from, I'm going to use the drone camera like I am right now to just check out the immediate area at the end of the runway and just get a little bit of a feel for what I might have to deal with once I'm airborne. There is some math that you could do to figure out if you're going to have enough distance to clear any obstacles at the end of the runway, but I generally just like to make a judgment call. I mean, you got to keep some excitement in it after all. The next mistake, which I've been guilty of on a couple of occasions myself, is not configuring the airplane properly for takeoff. Each airplane has a checklist that you can use once your flight is loaded, but there are a few items on those lists that are more important than others, and that's the trim, flaps, and throttle quadrant levers. All of these are critical to takeoff, and if they aren't set properly, it could result in a much longer takeoff roll, or you might fail to get airborne at all. The first thing I do is check the trim is set properly for takeoff. You can see right here I've got it very close to the center, and that should be okay for most takeoffs. If the trim is set to too high of a nose up position, the plane is going to lift off the ground prematurely. Inversely, if I set the trim into too much of a nose down position, I'm going to have the opposite problem. When I pull back on the stick, the airplane's just not going to want to take off at all. I've covered the trim in depth in a previous video, and you can check it out if you want to learn all the ins and outs of it, not just for takeoff, but for every single phase of flight. The flaps also need to be set for takeoff. The exact flap position for takeoff is going to be different per airplane, but usually it's going to actually be the first notch, which is going to give you around 10 to 15 degrees of deflection, which is going to generate the most lift possible while generating as little drag as possible as well. I also recently released a flaps deep dive, and I'll put a link to that one if you want to review it as well. Finally, there's the throttle, prop, and mixture controls. The throttle should always be advanced to full on the general aviation airplanes on absolutely every single takeoff. The same goes for the propeller control. You want to make sure it's pushed all the way in for takeoff as well, so you generate the maximum RPMs for the airplane. In most cases, the mixture control should be pushed in as well. Today I'm flying in a turboprop airplane, so the red lever is actually the condition lever, but even in this case, as I'm about to get flying, I want to make sure that it's in the high idle position. In a regular propeller-based airplane, this is actually the mixture control, which is controlling the air-to-fuel mixture, and you're also going to want to make sure that one's all the way in as well. In both cases, it's going to allow your engine to develop the maximum amount of power possible during takeoff. The only exception is a takeoff at altitude with a prop-based airplane, where you're going to have to lean the mixture properly before takeoff to make sure the engine develops enough power so you can get airborne. And as you can probably guess by now, I've also got a video on the throttle quadrant if you would like to consult it and have a little bit more information about how to use those levers throughout your flight. Alright, moving on. There are 3 phases to every takeoff: the roll over the ground, the actual takeoff, and the initial climb. The next 3 mistakes I'm going to look at are related to each one of those phases. During the takeoff roll, single-engine airplanes have a tendency to lean or yaw to the left because of the torque effects of the engine and the propeller. The effects can become exaggerated if you slam the throttle all the way to full immediately. So to avoid that, what you want to do is you want to apply power smoothly and continuously until you've reached full power. There's always going to be a little bit of yaw though, even if you do apply the power very smoothly. That means that at the same time as you're applying power, you need to be ready to adjust for that yaw, either with the twist action of your controller or with your rudder pedals. This is of course assuming that you have auto rudder turned off in the difficulty options, which I highly recommend if you either have pedals or a joystick. On the Xbox, it's probably a little bit more difficult to control that though, so I would probably leave it on in that case. The next thing to watch out for as you're accelerating down the runway is becoming airborne before achieving the proper flying speed. Each airplane has a different rotation speed and you need to be aware of it, and I've listed a few common ones on screen for your convenience. If you force the plane to leave the ground before you get to the right airspeed, you might end up stalling the wing as its angle of attack is going to become too high, and that might either result in a failed takeoff because the wing could stall, or even a crash because you can't achieve sufficient airspeed in order to fly the airplane. If you're using the working title mod for planes equipped with the G1000, you'll see the VR speed shown on screen right in the bottom left, and that's the speed at which you should rotate or start pulling back on the stick. You'll also see a little R on the airspeed tape as you accelerate, so it makes it easy to know when you have to start pulling back. You don't even have to look for the number, you can just look for that little R, and that's when you want to slowly start rotating the airplane. On top of all of that, you want to avoid over-rotating as well once you do achieve the correct airspeed. As you get close to takeoff speed, just start very gently pulling back on the stick and the plane's going to get airborne naturally. A rapid change in nose-up pitch if you start just yanking back on the stick is going to cause a proportionate change in the effects of torque, and it's going to make the airplane a lot harder to control as you get airborne. Things continue to happen really quickly after takeoff, with the airspeed increasing rapidly once you're airborne. I already spoke about knowing the right airspeed at which to rotate or pull back on the stick to get airborne, but there are 3 more airspeeds that you should be aware of and know when to use them, and that's VX, VY, and cruise climb speed. VX is the slowest of the 3, but it'll give you the most altitude gained for the least distance traveled over the ground. You generally use VX when there is an obstacle at the end of the runway that needs to be avoided, and then you would switch to the next airspeed, which is VY. VY is faster than VX, and it'll get you to your cruise altitude at the best rate of climb. In other words, VY is going to give you the most altitude gain in the least amount of time. All you've got to do to accelerate from VX to VY is to reduce the pitch of the nose a little bit so that the airspeed can start creeping up again. Once it gets to VY, you want to adjust that pitch to make sure that you hold it at that airspeed. With the working tidal mod, you can see VX and VY on the primary flight display just below the airspeed tape. And exactly like with VR, as you're accelerating, you'll also see a little X and Y inside of the airspeed tape to indicate where those airspeeds are. The third airspeed, which I call cruise climb speed, is going to get you to your cruise altitude almost as efficiently as VY, but it's going to give you a much better forward visibility because you're going to have an even lower pitch. It'll result in a slightly lower rate of climb, but it's a small price to pay to be able to look at all of that beautiful default MSFS scenery. I use cruise climb speed once I reach pattern altitude of about 1,000 feet, and I keep it all the way up to my cruise altitude. There is a quick rule of thumb that you can use to calculate cruise climb speed, and that's to add the difference between VX and VY to VY. It won't be exactly what it's supposed to be, and there is probably a number rated in the airplane's pilot's operating handbook, but to be honest, you're going to get most of the benefit of cruise climb speed with just that rule of thumb, and you don't have to go digging through documents to figure out what airspeed you should be doing your climb to cruise at. And that's going to wrap it up for my quick overview of common takeoff mistakes in Microsoft Flight Sim. I hope you got some value from this video. If you did, please make sure to hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing that as well. And I'll see you in the next video.